Hi. So we are live, and this is the Pen Parentis Literary Salon for September 2020. 2020, the year of all things insane. One of the things that just happened is one of our authors just fell off the feed, and we're about to put her back on as I speak. There we go. And this could happen because it is 2020. We hope it gets better in November.
Thank you.
Anyway, so I'm MM DeVoe, and I am happy to that you all came. And I hope that as you show up, if you don't mind, just sort of drop a comment or a like so that we know that you exist and that you're there. I want you to know that the authors can actually read your comments. So if you are logged in to Facebook or YouTube, you can actually leave a comment that the authors can see and respond to in real time. We are trying to bring this as close to a real experience of like talking with authors in a room as we can during these nutty times. And so I hope that you will take advantage of that and just write like, hey, it's, this is me, I'm from South Dakota, and I'm so happy to be here. We would love to get that kind of comment. So tell us who you are and tell us where you're from. And in the meantime, I will tell you that this Pen Parentis Literary Salon has been made possible in part with public funds from the Creative Engagement Grant. It is supported by the NYC Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and administered by LMCC. And what that really means is thank you for paying your taxes, because your taxes make this possible. And it also means thank you so much for donating. If you did donate individually, that means something. That means something big. And so we really appreciate it. Let's see. So without further ado, I think I will introduce Christina Chu, and she is the curator of the Pen Parentis Literary Salons, and she is also a phenomenal author, and her book, Beauty, is out now, and she can be seen on Zooms everywhere in everybody's screen because she is pretty active on these kind of author chats. But we are very lucky because we had her first. And she is going to introduce authors to us, and we're going to hear some readings, and we're going to talk. And our subject today is New York, New York, which is my favorite subject in possibly the world. And so we're going to talk about like all things literary, things that used to be, things that are now, things that might be to come. We may even go there. We encourage you to ask your questions, to write comments. We will respond to them. And let's see if Christina, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry, I am so technologically adept. This is what I meant to do. Christina, take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's really wonderful to see you all. I have to say, Pen Parentis is like home to me. It's such a special place. And we have been working on this salon for 2 years now, trying to find the right people for it. September's kind of a weird time for New Yorkers ever since, I guess, 9/11. And so it just seemed like it'd be a great time to have a salon that was devoted just to topics of New York and stories about New York. So we have these incredible authors tonight, and I'm really excited about this. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And you get to hear them and hear their amazing stories. And our first author tonight, I mean, this is just going to show you, starting off with a bang here. All these authors are incredible. One of them, of course, David, does not admit to being a writer. He is, in fact, a writer, just like the rest of us. Sorry, David. So our first reader is Carola Hines. She's a novelist in New York City. Her novel, Someday Everything Will All Make Sense, was a finalist for the Nilsen Prize for first novel and an American Fiction Award. Her fictions appeared in literary journals including Fence, Hayden's Ferry Review, Denver Quarterly, and Literal Latte. Her short story, Papijack, is that right? Papijack? Won the Lamar York Prize for fiction. She's been a finalist for the Mary McCarthy Prize in short fiction, the David Nathan Meyerson Fiction Prize, the New Letter Short Story Award, and the Disquiet Literary Prize. You're getting my drift here. She's a graduate of New York University. I don't usually mention stuff like that, except she has had the great luck of working as a student of Phil Schultz at the Writer's Studio, and she's worked with Rick Moody, who has also been with Pen Parentis more than once, and who's a real advocate of Pen Parentis. She is the mother of a 15-year-old, a student at Bronx Science, which I'm kind of familiar with because my kids at STI. And she spent many years practicing commercial litigation. Can you believe that? She also has time to write, and is also, on top of that, a musician. So everyone, please welcome Carola Hines. I can't wait to hear her read.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, MM and Christina and Pen Parentis. I'm really excited about this as well. I'm a native New Yorker, born and bred, so this theme means a lot to me. And also my book, which comes from a fortune in a fortune cookie. Someday everything will all make sense. So I like to say it's both ironic in this book and aspirational at the same time. But this book follows Luther van der Loon, who's a kind of Ignatius J. Reilly sort of character. He's a professor of medieval music. And as the book begins, he loses his mother tragically, and the book is about him kind of stumbling through his stages of grief, and it's funny and sad at the same time. And there's a lot of, he lives in Tudor City, which is where I live also. So there are a lot of New York settings in here. So I'm gonna put the glasses on, and I'm gonna read the opening scene and maybe a little other short chapter from the beginning. So just stop me if I'm going on too long. Mother choked on a bowl of wonton soup, a tangle of bok choy, a larger than expected dumpling, a wayward thatch no one could foresee. Asphyxiation is a silent but awful affair. The soundless yelps, the evocative hand around the throat, the desperate pantomime. Help me. I leapt to perform the Heimlich, driving my fist into the soft space underneath her breastbone, but I elicited only a pathetic hiccup. Breathe, I commanded, driving my fist harder. The foreign body insinuated itself in the trachea, disallowing air passage. No words to communicate her distress. Like a harpsichord with a truncated disposition, certain notes impossible to sound. Mother, I prevailed upon her. But it was too late. The foreign body had irretrievably lodged in her airway. My efforts to expel the wonton, desperate thrusts, entreaties to a heaven I only provisionally believed in, futile. An inadvisable blind sweep of the airway, contrary to all protocols for administering aid to a choking victim, only drove the object deeper, beyond the grasp of my feeble digits. Oh, Mother. She was only 62. It was a stupid way to die, and she did not even get to enjoy her General Tso chicken. The wonton soup was a free appetizer included in the meal. The dinner special from Seven Happiness Chinese Takeout. Choice of entree, wonton soup, $14.95 plus tax, guaranteed to arrive in under 20 minutes. She did not eat her fortune cookie, which I opened long after the ambulance crew had left, with my expired mother on a gurney. A crumbling oracle, it said, someday everything will all make sense. Okay, I'm going to read another short bit. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. And Luther struggles with this loss, and one of the things he does is he's angry about the way his mother died, and I'll just read the next section and you'll see what happens. In the lobby the following morning, I chanced to bump into Adrienne LaPlanta, a fellow shareholder. She offered me her condolences, nodding sympathetically as I described, perhaps too graphically, the manner of Mother's death. She was a counselor at law and unduly interested in the minutiae of the accident. Was my mother drinking at the time? Was she under the influence of prescription medication? Did she have a swallowing disorder? Was she trying to talk and eat at the same time? Was she eating in the usual sitting position? Did I perhaps save the rest of the soup, or had I hastily discarded it? Did I partake? If so, did I encounter an impossible-to-chew wonton? I enjoy being able to discuss freely these topics, rather than receiving the usual grimace, the gentle reproach. Are you okay? Have you gotten help? Given Ms. LaPlanta's professional calling, I recognize that her interest in Mother's death might well be pecuniary, her thorough dissection of the events leading up to Mother's death, an informal case evaluation. If I may, she patted my arm, I think you've suffered a loss for which you may be entitled to compensation. You think so? I asked. I, of course, viewed Seven Happiness as the agent of Mother's death, in the same way Zarlino blamed his treacherous pupil, Vincenzo Galilei, for the demise of the mean-tone temperament. But I had not considered that Seven Happiness might be liable in the legal sense, that I might be entitled, as Ms. LaPlanta explained, to compensation for my losses, both in my individual capacity and as mother's heir. Do you think she suffered? Ms. LaPlanta inquired, head sympathetically tilted. I've tried not to dwell on that aspect, I replied. Of course, she nodded, averting her eyes. The wonton became stuck in her throat and the life drained from her. Was she aware of what was happening? Yes, I'm sure of it. I could see it on her face. She clutched her throat, she shook her head. I tried to perform the Heimlich maneuver. Here I stumbled, but was not successful. I'm so sorry. Terrifying, she commiserated. I can assure you that you are entitled, as her distributee, to be compensated for her conscious pain and suffering. I know it's small comfort, but you can make them pay for your mother's suffering. Put a stop to this irresponsible practice of dispensing wonton soup to the unsuspecting. I nodded. Take my card, she offered. If you're interested in pursuing legal action, just give us a call. I looked at the card. Adrian LaPlanta, Esquire, Attorney at Law, Bloodstone and Moore, LLP. Thank you very much, Ms. LaPlanta. Well, I'm off to court. I hope you'll call. You really deserve to be compensated for your loss. Her heels clicked across the floor. I don't want to go too long.
I love the name Bloodstone for it.
I'm just going to open the light in my room.
There's a lot of that in here. You know, there's a lot of kind of wordplay as well of obviously the wonton and the wanton nature, which, you know, death generally, but Luther is a kind of hapless kind of character, and, you know, he's sort of funny looking, he's awkward, he has a skin condition where he flakes, you know, he's just kind of all around kind of awkward person. But he's kind of a surrogate for all of us in terms of, you know, what it's like to cope with the loss. It's just a little more absurd for him, you know.
Excellent. So I don't know if you could see the comments that there are people here that you may know. Joyce Yarrow from Seattle. Is anybody?
Joyce.
And let's see who else. I have some comments here from New Mexico, Michael Nadler. So, and Lisa Wixon from New York, New York. So we are very pleased, and please continue to tell us if you're here so that we can let our guests know that you're here and listening. Go ahead, Christina. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. So, so thank you so much, Carol. We're actually we're going to hold off on the discussion till the end when everyone's read. Okay. So, our next reader is David Dunbar. David is the author of the award-winning Empire City, New York Through the Centuries. He pretty much knows everything about New York. So, if ever you need to know anything about it, he's the guy to ask. He knows. So keep that in mind. He's a fellow of the New York Academy of History, following over 2 decades of teaching at Deerfield Academy, Milton Academy, and Albuquerque Academy. David moved to New York and started something called City Term at the Master's School. He was the academic dean and member of the interdisciplinary urban core teaching team at City Term for 21 years, which is actually how I first met him, because he had invited me over there to read, and we will actually talk for a little moment later about what City Term is about, because if you have kids, this is one of the most interesting programs I have ever seen in my whole life. So while at the master's school, David also served as the coordinator of teaching and learning initiatives. He earned his BA from Amherst College, his MAR from Yale, and has been the recipient of the Woodrow Wilson Klingenstein Fulbright Fellowships. David has 2 sons that are grown and 3 grandsons, and one also coming this December. So everyone, please welcome David Dunbar.
Great. Thank you very much, Christina. And it was great. And you should all know that Christina, when Juno Diaz, who was somebody who came to City Term all the time, moved to Boston, I needed someone of that caliber. So I got Christina because she'd just done Troublemaker and Other Saints. So you probably came, I don't know, maybe 10 times, a lot of times up to meet with City Term students. It was wonderful. So I'm going to read from, I'm not going to read from Empire City, which is all about New York. I'm going to read from something else. So I'll just sort of start. But I'm a lifelong educator who designed and implemented a 1-semester experience-based program, as Christina said, that focused on New York City. And then in 2002, I wrote and edited a book with Kenneth Jackson from Columbia, who really knows a lot more about New York than I do, exploring what makes New York, New York. But what follows is an excerpt of the introduction to a very different book that doesn't have a title yet. So I'll start. On poets, Zen masters, cognitive scientists, and the princes of serendipity. Leaning forward towards the Dodge Poetry Festival audience, poet Jane Hirschfield explained the complicated world of Zen Buddhism. Pretty much comes down to 3 things. Everything changes, everything is connected, pay attention. Years later, I was attending a conference on learning and the brain, exploring what cognitive scientists and psychologists have learned about working memory. Working memory is what we use when we're trying to hold on to information, but simultaneously rearrange it or combine it to create a new thought or idea. One of the major problems with working memory is it doesn't seem to be very good at paying attention. And one of the biggest and most complicated problems that researchers have is defining what attention actually is and why it seems to go walkabout so easily. However, it turns out that all those times when we've been chastised for not paying attention is a much more complicated mindset than we realized. In fact, scientists actually see paying attention as having 3 subcomponents: alertness, orienting, and executive attention. Alertness is just what it says it is. Are you awake? Although you could be too caffeinated and then you would be hyper alert. Orienting occurs when you're concentrating on the stimuli that helps you focus on the problem at hand. And executive function is the voluntary effortful control of cognitive processes. So, in short, it turns out that poets and cognitive scientists have remarkably similar ways of thinking. And one of the things they share most common is that they're both fascinated by the act of learning, and particularly learning that occurs on the deepest and most profound levels. For the past couple of decades, I've explored the intersection of paying attention and that kind of learning. Each day when I first came to New York City in July 1996, I would take the train into the city with my 2 young sons to explore and to figure out how I was going to have a curriculum in August based on a city I knew nothing about. And each night we would return with tales of things that had happened to us. It felt a little bit like Dr. Seuss' book, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, but for grown-ups. The 3 of us would regale the other people also living in the head of school's house with stories of the people we had met, the things we had discovered. And one woman would say every night, "You are so lucky. That is so serendipitous." Things like that used to happen to me when I moved to the city 10 years ago. They don't happen as much anymore. But what had in fact happened was that this woman had lost the capacity for what the Zen masters call beginner's mind, or Shoshin. The tagline for this concept is that in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. I myself prefer the quantum physicist Niels Bohr's definition, of an expert as someone who has made all the mistakes that can be made in a very narrow field. But I agree with the Zen masters that it is our preconceptions and our tendency to slide new data into old cognitive ruts that had doomed this woman to being an expert on New York City. It turns out that translators have chosen the 10 most difficult words to translate. And the word that interests me right now is number 3, serendipity. Serendipity by the dictionary is the luck some people have in finding or creating interesting or valuable things by chance. My intuition, however, tells me there is more to this than the conventional definition. The actual word serendipity was invented by Sir Horace Walpole in a letter on January 28, 1754. He wrote, "I once read a silly fairy tale called The Three Princes of Serendip, and as their highnesses traveled, they were always making discoveries by accidents and sagacity of things they were not in quest of. What the tutors of the three princes are entrusted with is to teach their charges to be serendipitous." But look back at the dictionary definition of the word. How does one teach luck or chance? But what if it is not chance or luck at all? What if being serendipitous is a skill you could cultivate? Could you exacerbate the skill of discovering things by accident you were not in quest of? What a skill to master if I could. And then could it be taught, as it was to the three princes of Serendip? Or was it an example of something that could be learned, but could never be taught? What the poets, the Zen masters, the cognitive scientists, and the prince's tutors all have in common is exactly what this book is about: paying attention. I want to explore how to pay attention, and then what to pay attention to. Those questions are the central questions for the book, and the larger question: why do some people seem to have more things happen to them than other people? Why are their lives richer in detail? Why are they happier when small things delight them? Some people just seem to generate more experiences than other people. And those people seem more fulfilled and more eager about life. Is it possible that part of the problem we have is that we aren't good at paying attention, and therefore we don't have the pleasure of this kind of learning? This book is an exploration of how to pay attention and the way it will change your life. But first, we need to explain why learning is so complicated and why experience is not what we usually think it is. That's it.
That's cool. I want everybody to talk about one time when something serendipitous happened in New York, because you are not wrong. New York City is like unbelievable at connecting and finding things and making things happen that you're just really surprised by, from when you're, like hoping that the train will come and then it does.
Yep. It is one of the many things that I learned in 20 some years of, exploring the city.
Does anybody have, can you think back and think of anything that happened that was just complete serendipity that happened in New York City that just...
I have a really good one. I'll start. Good. So I moved out to the suburbs for a while, and when I moved back, I contacted a writer friend of mine who I actually studied with at one point. His name is Charles, and we had lunch, and he said, "I'm sorry, I have to cut lunch short because I'm in the middle of a move." And I said, "Oh, that's so funny, because we are too." And I'm like, "We're moving on to, Riverside Boulevard, where I live." And he's like, "That's so funny, I am too." He's like, "You know which building?" And I'm like, I'm really bad with numbers. I have a dyslexia kind of thing. So I'm like, I don't want to say anything. I'll find out. Get home, I email him, and he emails me back. We're in the same building.
Awesome. I love that. Do you guys have anything like that you've done where you just I
have almost an identical story to that. I went on a business trip to California with a colleague, and we spent a week out there, and we came back to the airport, and we were like, "Do you want to share a cab home?" Sure. We both lived in Manhattan. So I said, "Where do I need to drop you off?" And she's telling me, "Well, I'm on, off 2nd Avenue on 41st Street." I'm like, "Wow, that's funny. So am I, And then we got closer, and same thing. We lived in the same building and had lived in the same building for years. And I just had no idea.
That's a good one.
I-
I found all of my apartments by serendipity. Like every single New York City apartment that I found is because like I walked by, there was a sign, the place was available. It was the day that I started looking that, you know, like that. I don't know. It's almost like New York City real estate. You have to constantly tell people that you're
There's
looking.
no easy way in New York to find a place to live. That's for sure.
Right.
No, I would say, I would say it happens all the time, because if you work in experience-based learning, one of the things that the phrase we always use is the world speaks. So the world is constantly speaking, and New York is a very noisy place. Although Barry Lopez, who's somebody that I really like and have talked to a lot about this, would argue that it happens all the time in Arctic Dreams and any number of other places. It's just that we don't know how to pay attention there. But we have a better shot of engineer. So I have countless. I mean, they happen all the time, because the more you listen, the more it happens. But I'll tell one, as long as we're here for a little bit, which is it stayed with me for a long time. City Term did a program called Midnight Run. Midnight Run is actually run out of a guy in Dobbs Ferry who was homeless. And you'll find it in the streets. If you walk around, they run 365 days a year. It happens at about midnight. It is people who have volunteered come up, and they distribute food, and they distribute clothing and toiletries, and a lot of schools do this kind of stuff. We do it in conjunction with another author named Lee Stringer, a memoirist who wrote Grand Central Winter. Fantastic book. He, along with Christine, used to be one of the authors we had all the time at City Term. But so we would go out to Midnight Run. Now, what happens is you've got a lot of kids who are from all over the country who really, and it's midnight, roughly, in New York, and you're talking to homeless people, and you try to prepare them in some ways, because it's really not about it's not about the clothing, it's not really about the food, it's really about the interaction with the people. So here's one that happens. And so the kids are usually nervous, like really nervous. And so this one woman is sitting there talking with somebody, and I usually say, well, ask them where they're from or what's going on. She strikes up a conversation with somebody and goes, oh yeah, so where are you from? And he asked her, and she says, I'm from Cleveland. And he goes, I'm from Cleveland. And he goes, oh. And he goes, where? And she goes, Shaker Heights. And he goes, I used to live in Shaker Heights. What street? And she says the name of the street. He goes, there was a couple of streets over from that, but I know where that is. So you went to such and such a school. And she goes, I did go to it. I did. And they're going on, and finally they're talking a little more. And he looks at her and he goes, you know, you really look a lot like somebody I know. And he goes, do you know? Says the name. And she looks at him and goes, that's my aunt. and he goes, I had the feeling you look a lot like her. Now you got to remember, this is a homeless guy who's sitting there talking with this girl. And she looks and she kind of goes, wow. And he goes, well, when you can't really talk to her, you know, about the fact that you met me, because we actually dated when we were at Yale together. And the girl's going, you're kidding. Like, and there's a whole story about how he becomes homeless and how that happens. And the girl is sitting there just going like, I can't believe it. Like, you dated my aunt. And it's one of those stories that is, talk about serendipitous, but it's also just goosebumps. But that kind of stuff happens actually all the time, especially if you walk the streets of New York.
There's a couple of really good comments on the comment line of people who are, have met people that they knew or seen somebody that they know. I also had an experience where a friend of mine who almost never comes into the city, I hadn't seen him for years. I went to his birthday party, and his wife threw him a big 40th birthday party surprise in New York, and I showed up, and he was like, oh yeah, I'll definitely see you next time in New York. Next time in New York, I'll see you. And he lived in a different state. And the next time I saw him was when I ran into him on the street. He hadn't told me he was in New York. I happened to be walking out for lunch, and I walked, and there he was on the street, like without having told me that he was in New York. And I'm like, you thought I wasn't going to catch you, you know, but it's just incredible. Let's see if I can read one of these. Here, somebody named M said, this 1990s movie villain looking man who owned a big club in Madison Square Garden asked what event we were going to, and then ended up inviting us to go to his club for free whenever we were next in the city. We ended up having a deep conversation on life on the way to the Met. We forgot to ask his name since we were so lost in conversation, but we have his number, as in Queens Club owner, villain man. That's great. Great story. But
it's also,
really,
the whole notion of experience, though, is that you're right, the notion of New York as a place to learn how to make events into experiences is you're totally right. It's remarkable in that way, and some of them are poignant, and some of them are. But it happens in part because New York. Well, there's a number of things that I think New York does, but it doesn't resolve a whole series of tensions. And one of the ones you're talking about is the difference between public and private. Public and private is like totally up for grabs in New York, in the way that, Christine, if you go to the suburbs, it's just not the same. Public is public and private is private. And we all know we could play the same thing. What have you heard on the streets of New York that you just could not believe that someone was saying? And that's part of what fuels the serendipity, is that what New York refuses to do is to reconcile a certain series of tensions. And one of the most fundamental tensions is public and private, which, by the way, people who don't want to live in New York, which is a big thing now, everybody's moving to South Florida from what I hear. It's like they realize that they're going to be missing a lot.
Well, one of the things that I find really fabulous for writers, especially, is that, like, with Carol's novel, she opens up a fortune teller, a fortune cookie, and there's like the little something, and then she starts writing this book. I just think all the amazing experiences that are so New York, and you could see in a Woody Allen movie, right? Like, it's so, you can't really necessarily get them anywhere, and maybe we're just listening for them more, Beverly, did you have something that you want to share?
What's interesting when you talk about New York is that I've been very focused on the new evictions that are going to be happening. And actually, my novel that I'm going to read from is about the dissolution of a family who live in the Bronx who are evicted. And now I wrote this book during the recession of 2007, 2008. And now I fear we're going to be seeing the exact same things again because of the pandemic, because of Trump, because of all the difficult things that are happening. And a shout out to Black Lives Matter, which I must do. And so what I'm going to read from, I don't know if you're ready for me, Christina, to read.
Sure. Ready.
All right. Do you want to do the bio and then I'll do
I'll do the bio now.
Okay.
So everyone, this is Beverly Gologorsky.
Well
She's
said.
sorry, what?
The name is so hard. I said, well said.
I did a good job. I love it. I love your name. She's the author of the just published Everybody Has a Story. It's awesome. You got to read it. As well as the novels, The Things We Do to Make It Home and Stop Here. Her novel, Can You See the Wind, is forthcoming this spring. Yay! Her work has appeared in all kinds of anthologies and magazines, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and she's recently contributed essays to several anthologies and political journals, Viet Report and Thank you, Levanten. She's well known as an activist in women's and peace movements. She lives in New York. Her partner, Charles Wiggins, lives in New England, where Gologorsky spends a great deal of time. So she's already been doing that here and then there and all that stuff. The rest of us are just starting to do that since March, but she's been doing that forever. She's got a daughter and her
and a granddaughter.
What?
And a granddaughter.
Oh my God, and a granddaughter. Man, everyone please welcome Beverly.
Thank you, Christina. So this is about the dissolution of a family after an eviction who live in the Bronx. And I'm going to read a short scene which is about Dory, who works in a nursing home in Washington Heights. Dory takes the elevator to the hospital's sub-basement and gives her name to the receptionist of the nuclear radiology department, who couldn't care less that it's taken her all these months to make an appointment. She's hopeful, though. Sometimes viruses last ridiculously long. At the nursing home, a strain of stomach flu put some of her charges out of commission for weeks. Then just when they seemed well, they were suddenly back on the potty. It isn't exactly the runs that sent her here, though, but the nausea and the stabbing headaches she can just about dim with aspirin. She's told no one about this morning's MRI, doesn't want anyone praying or fretting her outcome. Some journeys must be taken alone, and this is one of them, though neither Stu nor Lena would agree. Alone provides opportunity to treat event and outcome on her terms without seeing either reflected in the eyes of others. She's susceptible, she is, to what people believe or fear, and above all, doesn't want to be treated in that sweet, syrupy way that brings death to mind. It's what she does at work, uses cheery phrases for people who know this is the last place they'll ever inhabit. A young woman with a stunned expression sits nearby, her fingers raking obsessively through her long hair. No more than 20, with large gray eyes fastened on some vision beyond anyone's grasp. Her presence feels sad, hopeless, but Dory refuses to take it as an omen. She considers saying something to distract her, but before she can, a technician arrives and leads the woman out. As she picks up a magazine, which is what people do in places like this to avoid speculating, her name is called. She follows the technician's white-clad back to a tiny cave-like room where a machine that brings to her mind pictures of an ancient iron lung sits ready to televise slices of her brain. Above it, on an adjacent wall, is a small glass enclosure where the radiologist watches the procedure. The technician warns her that the MRI makes a lot of noise. She hands her 2 waxy earplugs and a ball to squeeze if it gets too much for her. She has no intention of squeezing that ball. When did she ever cry uncle? She stuffs the plugs in her ears, climbs in the tunnel, and as the rattling and banging begins, like her old radiator trying to send up heat, suddenly decides she's claustrophobic. Okay, best not to focus on the narrow space or noise. Better to go over her mental checklist, the one she's added to and subtracted from since the initial episode. As of this morning, she still enjoys eating and drinking. There's been no drop in her energy, no trouble sleeping, and she'd enjoy sex if Stu ever offered. She knows that her cardio and respiratory systems are good to go. So the test will most likely be negative, though she knows better than to count on it, because MRIs, CAT scans, and the like find abnormalities that may never affect a person adversely, yet once discovered, are hard to ignore. Every body contains some congenital fuck-up. This she believes. Before machines provided 3D pictures of bodily spaces, people lived with their imperfections. So why is she here? Don't move, man. The voice echoes eerily inside the chamber. She doesn't think she's moved a muscle. Is she supposed to stop breathing? Is this a significant moment? The final take, the part of the brain where problems reside? Closing her eyes tight, her cold palms flat against the thin mat, she concentrates on her nursing institute charge, Miss Z, who never gives up hope. Thank you.
Yay!
Thank you. So, something that you said, Beverly, that's so interesting is, your concern with what's happening in the environment around us.
Absolutely.
Is always factoring into your work. And I think that that's, so interesting because we're about to hit another one of those periods, right? Like you talked about 2008, and it's feeling like we're about to enter something as bad, if not worse, right?
Right. I mean, one thing that's been going through my mind is this line, for the love of our children, we must vote to get rid of Trump. It's been a line, I wake up with it, I hear it during the day. I mean, wherever I am, I want to say it out loud, in elevators and everywhere else, because I feel it very deeply.
Oh, yeah.
Have you evolved from one social justice topic to another, like throughout your life? What was the first thing that sort of captivated you and made you?
Civil rights. I'm old. I was back there. I did it then and I do it now. Sure, and it's really, it's not just about justice. It's about people who don't have power, the inequality of a lack of power, the terrible importance of absolutely finding a way to change the system, to make it better for people. There's even food inequality among children. I mean, this is crazy in this country that kids don't have enough to eat. I mean, what does one do except Black Lives Matter are out there every single day. My heart goes out to it.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to ask a question that kind of dovetails on this, because I know that, Beverly, you write about these topics and they become the subject of a lot of your work. So what I really wanted to ask was, are there any scenes that come from your actual life? Like I know, and with Carol, she, at one point comes up with this idea with the fortune telling little fortune. Did you actually come across something like that and make the decision to do that, or did that just come from your?
That happened during the writing, actually, which comes back to this serendipity concept. I think it's like once you start writing a book and your mind is attuned to things that relate, it's sort of like a magnet, I feel, that brings these things, and it's for you to notice them. So I opened that while I was reading the book. There's lots of other stuff I wove in there, even, during the writing of it. There's one episode where Luther goes to this hellacious part of Kennedy Airport to pick up some kind of period instrument, and he gets stuck in this like bureaucratic mess. And, I went through something similar, getting this Moroccan vase out of Kennedy, but there's all sorts of things in your life that you just kind of pilfer, that seem to relate to the thematic elements of the book. For my book in particular, a lot of the setting came from my life, because Luther works at some place called New York State University. I went to New York University, also happens to be located downtown. He hangs out in a bar called the Hairy Monk, which is kind of like a mashup of other pub names, from my life. And he lives in Tudor City, which is where I live in. That Tudor City, which a lot of even New Yorkers are not aware of, because it's such a weird little quarter that's situated in a cul-de-sac on a dead end, and it's really close to the United Nations, and lots of people come and look at the UN and are totally unaware that it's there, unless they happen to go up a wrong road by accident. And Tudor City itself has this really bizarre history, because it actually was the first housing development in New York City, which I did a little research on it for my book, and also learning about my own neighborhood. And it's interesting if people, I'm sure anyone on Facebook has seen this, but they have this interactive map now from like the 40s. So you could just type in your address and see the lot that you're on and what it looked like back then. And it's super interesting. Like if my building, most of the buildings in this area were built in the 20s, but there are sort of gaps. Like the building next door there used to be a tennis court there. You know, there's the parks were 42nd Street was widened at a certain point. There used to be like a kind of rock or something that a road went through to get to where First Avenue is now. And that's all changed. You know, Tudor City's also, probably more people have seen it in movies, you know, than in real life. Notably, one of the Spider-Man movies. Scarface has a whole long extended scene, you know, where Tony Montana comes to New York and he's surveilling someone that lives in 5 Tudor City Place. And, you know, they go on this chase and there's a car bomb under there. And, you know, I'm sure most people have seen that movie, but it's interesting, you know, and so the place, you know, it's where I live, and it's also kind of the topography, especially for Luther in this novel, becomes like the arena of his loss. You know, everywhere he goes reminds him of his mother, which is a kind of typical experience for a grieving person, where you go to the same haunts, you know, that you went to before with that person, but they're no longer there. And part of it is mourning, part of it is kind of cementing your associations with that person. And, you know, the actual landscape, I think, becomes this kind of, you know, you have the markers of your loss in the actual physical landscape too.
It's really interesting to write about New York City. It occurs to me that it's similar to writing about technology, because New York changes on such a frequent basis that if you set something in a real, let's call it realistic, but real place, there's every chance that place won't be there in 2 weeks, much less 2 years.
Exactly.
I mean, even places that we thought were we're all the way downtown by, you know, when we moved in by the World Trade Center. So it's really interesting how these even actual landmarks can get taken away and changed. And, you know, the longer your history, the more change actually, you know, happens to your setting.
I think about there was an interesting segment on 60 Minutes the other night about an old Greek Orthodox church by the Twin Towers, which I know realized, have been there forever and destroyed.
Yeah, it destroyed, and it's currently a shell.
Right.
Yeah. There right now it's a cement shell, because I think halfway through the reconstruction, there was some kind of crazy thing happening with money disappearing and all kinds of I don't know, crime, interesting white collar crime stuff. And then, but now I think they have, you know, found a new nonprofit board to run it and have restarted the actual construction. And I think I'm not sure, but I thought Calatrava designed it. Am I wrong? Does anybody know architecture?
No.
The Calatrava designed this thing. This is this thing. It's the Oculus. Yeah, but it looks like this.
Right.
Yeah, I think
that's what it looks like,
because they were talking about that also in the segment.
Yeah, I think he designed it. So it'll be interesting to see what it actually looks like when it's finished, because right now it just looks like a cement, like Lego piece thing. It's very gray.
One of the things that's interesting about New York is that also makes it distinctive is that it is, I think, the most democratic small d. It's also democratic big D. You know, city in the world, actually, because in order to what you remind me of is the Colson Whitehead, you know, line where he says, no matter how long you've been here, the first time you become a New Yorker, you know, when you just go, that used to be whatever, and that's part of the whole idea of the tension of creative destruction. In other words, New York is all about this not resolving, you know, creative destruction in the way it goes. So the idea of becoming a New Yorker, which is not true in other places, like you go to other cities and you go to even other countries. Like my older son lives in Scotland. Like he will, even though he looks really Scottish, as soon as he opens his mouth. He never. There is no such thing as an American Scotsman, but there are Scottish Americans, and there are Filipino Americans, and there are Italian Americans, and there are Chinese Americans. Because if you want to be American, but if you really want to be American, you can be a New Yorker as soon as you start behaving like a New Yorker. That's the only admission, right?
I mean, the thing about New York that, you know, someone recently said to me, hope has not been canceled, which is really true about New York. I mean, we went through a petri dish of pandemic, and I hope we don't have to go through that again. But I met someone in the elevator the other day, and he said to me, yeah, you know, you can't not be hopeful in New York. New York has this power, this energy, this sense of life, and that life is still here. You know, there are stores that are closing and everything, and the economy and blah, blah, blah. We know all of that. But the energy, it's still here. It's what drives us to continue. And I think
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I just wanted to jump to the comments because speaking of energy, I love this. It's feeding me from outside in. Helene Epstein says hello to Beverly. Beverly, I guess she knows you from elsewhere, so I'm glad that she's here watching you. And also Shelley, who's watching from YouTube, said she has a question for all the speakers, particularly Carol. She wanted to know, how do you organize your writing time daily? And how do you balance it while working full time? So if you want to take a stab at that, that would be great. We can just run through and.
I tend to be, you know, I'm a pretty organized and regimented person. Part of that is just from having a long working life and being a mom and sort of, you know, and part of it is just, I find when I have a ritual, my mind is just open to doing something regularly. I find that works better for me. But I'm a morning writer. I like to do it. You know, I get up, I walk the dog, I clear my head, I read the paper, and then I start writing. So it's really the first thing I do. Nobody else is awake. And normally, depending on what I'm working on, I kind of spend half the time sort of reviewing. If I'm working on something longer, I'll just kind of page through what I've been doing, reminding myself of where I'm going, how I need to advance, you know, whichever character. And then the actual writing time, I really don't write more than 30 or 40 minutes because I kind of have a built-in, you know, time clock. I don't know. It's just so used to doing things at a certain time. And when I feel myself hitting that wall, I won't force it. And when I write, I put on music. And I just try to immerse myself and really, I feel like it almost in a kind of meditative state I write. I don't like to have, you know, I don't know.
Is it a specific kind of music? Do you choose music for the piece?
Yes, no, I absolutely have. It's almost Pavlovian. I don't listen to anything with words because I find that too disconcerting. And I like listening more to chamber music than orchestral music because it's sort of really intense but fewer instruments. And I really like listening like to Shostakovich or Beethoven string quartets. And it just puts me in the mood immediately. And, you know, and it's just kind of, I'm so accustomed to it at this point, and it just, you know, and I write at the same time every day. But what I do the other times of the day is there's always stuff filtering through my consciousness. I kind of like, along what David was talking about, when I'm writing something, I'm thinking about what I'm writing all the time, and I kind of pose questions to myself. So when something comes up in real life, I'm like, wow, okay, I could use that there. And it sort of all weaves back in, you know.
I think writers are gestating all the time. You know, I think what you're saying, Carol, I think writers are gestating their characters, their place, whatever, all the time without necessarily it being totally in the head, you know.
Right. And I think it's more, in some ways, that time is just as much, if not more valuable. I mean, I was listening to another lecture by someone who actually was an FBI profiler. And he was talking a little bit about, you know, memory and how his father had taught him. He was just giving an anecdote about how his father taught him how to write speeches when he was younger. And his father would tell him, you know, write one sentence, write like keywords, don't look at it again for another day. Then you come back, you write a sentence. And he was going on and he said, you know, I thought it was kind of silly. But when I became a profiler, I realized he was kind of revving up my subconscious to sort of focus on this. And the subconscious is what we call intuition, or it seems sort of, you know, something that we're kind of dismissive of sometimes because it's less logical. But he said that that mind, that part of the mind, actually, from a neuroscientific point of view, it works more quickly to put connections together than your conscious mind. So he said that work is going on all the time. And I think that happens with writers. I think you're just ruminating, you're mulling it over. And it's almost like a habit of mind that writers have, I think. It's just as important as the actual act of writing.
So one thing that I know from your bio is that you were, you studied with, or you were friends with Rick Moody, and he has read for us, as Christina has said. And I'm wondering, because New York is a place where you tend to run into famous people, you tend to run into interesting human beings. Is there anybody of this group who has had a mentor that either became famous or already was famous, or somehow is like an important, interesting human being that they just happen to know as a friend because of something? Because I think that that kind of stuff is part of the magic of New York, is that you get to see people who are heroes outside of New York as human beings who are just nice, you know?
Yeah, I bump into people all the time. I bumped into once Michael Cunningham, who in Soho, he was walking down the street. And at first I was like, maybe I shouldn't say anything because I could tell he was ruminating over some.
You broke his next novel, Christina.
So I was like hung out and was like, shouldn't I? And then he saw me. And then I'm like, sorry, I meant to.
What about you guys on the panel? Do you have any people?
Well, I was getting on a bus about 10, 15 years ago, and this gentleman said, you go first. And it was Philip Roth. So I love his work, and I got in the bus and I said to myself, say something. And I didn't.
Oh, you should have.
I didn't. But he was so polite. He said, no, you go first, you know, and we were all in a line going on the bus. But all my friends are great and famous and wonderful, so it's not a name thing.
I think that happens all the time. The very first the expedition that we took at City Term was in 1996 in the fall, and we go to the Whitney for a show that was showing there called New York, City of Ambition, which was actually a fantastic show if you go back that far. And I'm sitting there with a couple students, and we're looking at something, and I kind of glance out of the corner of my eye, and there's this like little furry haired dude with a baseball hat on, and this like much taller Asian woman standing next to him. Oh yeah, Christina, and it's Woody Allen. So I think that happens all the time. The thing that I'm interested in is, and what has been astounding to me is, and I'll just talk about writers in general, and this is partly how I met Christina, is somebody handed me, Troublemaker and Other Saints. I read it and I went, this is like an unbelievable book, and I need to have this person talk to my student. Then you have to go try to figure out whether they're actually the right person to talk to teenagers, which is only certain kinds of people can really do that, and some people can't do that at all. But in the course of it, one of the things I began to do was realize that people in New York are unbelievably friendly. Like unbelievably,
unless you're annoying.
The reason they're seen as rude is because they're going places and they're doing things. And people from other parts of the country, my students, will find them really rude, but they're not rude. They're just busy doing things. So, for example, in terms of writers, I mean, I was talking about Junot Diaz, but we had. In terms of just, if you just go to a reading and you go to talk to somebody and you say, listen, I've got this group of students who I really love your work, and they would want to, we've had Colin McCann, Jennifer Egan, Gary Steingart, like Joe O'Neill. It just keeps going down the list. all you got to do is ask. Mira Jacob is a friend as well. And it's just somebody you become friends. But that's because people in New York are incredibly generous about that stuff.
Yeah. Actually, it's not about time. Like I actually forgot to say that, for instance, that this is a nonprofit and Pen Parentis does have a mission. Like, I just left that out. So I'm going to say that right now, that we this is a nonprofit and we do have a mission, and that mission is to keep writers creative after they have kids. So the reason that we brought these three together is because they all have kids and they all have lots of books and really good writing careers. And we're just trying to show you that it's not an either or ever in your life. You just add to it. It's a plethora of extra. And yeah, okay, you might have to not sleep quite as much, but really, did you like that sleep? Were you really sleeping well to begin with? I mean, people who have no kids are not sleeping right now. So, but I do want to also, because a lot of our viewers are parents, David, do you want to talk a little bit about city term?
Oh, well, yes, a little. I mean, they sort of have already a little bit. Actually, the school that it was housed at went in a different financial model and closed it.
Oh,
a year ago. Yeah, Christina, sorry about that. They made some economic decisions, decided it wasn't making money, and sort of went that. So it actually doesn't exist anymore. But there are things that we're doing. I know there are things that we're doing that. That there's something called the DKDK project that my friend Erica Chapman and I are working on, which it works with schools and so forth. But
well, David, you should mention a lot of kids are actually, and a lot of parents are having their kids take a year off.
Yeah.
And so, David, can you talk a little bit about your program?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of different things that I'm working with, which is really interesting. And one of the things that I'm most interested in is whether or not it's possible to design, because what I'm interested in is transformational experiences. Why does an experience become transformational? And at some point, I don't know when we end, but I have a question for the four of you that I need to ask you, because you're going to help me out.
Ask us now. We're ready to answer.
Okay, let's do it right now. All right, here's the question. And all of you have done it. And Beverly, the title of your book is absolutely dead on, I think, in terms of what I'm doing. Here's the question. And it relates to what Carol was talking about, how we go about acquiring things in intuition and the unconscious. But it's slightly different. And what I'm interested in is, start with this as a premise, okay? What we know most deeply, we know in our bodies. Okay? What we know most deeply, we know in our bodies. I think this is true, okay? Now, what that means, however, as a writer or as someone who's just living, that what you're trying to figure out then is that your body is telling you things all the time, but the body does not work in language. It doesn't work in words. So the question becomes, as I'm looking at it, I'm curious about how you all, and Christina, I can talk specific, I give you as your work as an example. What I'm curious about from the others of you, when you go about writing, can you talk about a place where you come to something with a character who is in a place where essentially what they know in their body, but the fact of the matter is you're a writer who writes in words, which means that they need to try and figure out what their body is telling them. And I'll give an example. Amy Wong in Troublemaker and Other Saints is so divorced from her body, and it's highly sexual and completely divorced. Her body doesn't tell her, it does, but she can't hear a thing. And in Beauty, the most frustrating thing about her, all the way through, is that her body, and then you wrote about this all the time, you have lines in there where her body tells her something, literally, her head, her stomach, all kinds of things tell her. And she doesn't, but she can't get it, because even though she's highly physical, she doesn't listen to her body, except at the end of the book when she starts. And
don't tell the end of the book.
No, that's not the end. No, not the end of the book. The end of the book is that she listens to her body.
Are you telling me the end of the book?
No.
You just told me the end of the book.
No.
I am 3/4 of the way through this book.
What I'm curious is specifically whether that was intentional. I mean, were you aware that character literally starts to talk about what we talk about as the felt sense. Like, she has felt senses that she does. And Beverly, I'm curious about your characters, and Carol, your characters, whether there are times when you are writing where a character, where, you know, Luther essentially has a bodily experience about something, but what do you do with it? How do you express that when you get that? Does that make sense? Christina, you can start, because I know you must have thought about this.
Oh, I've thought about this for sure. I mean, I think that a lot of characters think they know things and they don't, and they're not aware of how they actually feel, which is how they get into the predicaments they get into, which is a really good example of the character that you mentioned. But I think it's so prevalent in life, not just literature, that people are just absolutely clueless about what they actually should be doing or anything. I find that regardless of how different characters can be, they can actually have the same issues.
Oh, absolutely. What about Carol, Beverly, or Emma? What do you think? I mean, if the body tells a story, you're listening to the body. I mean,
it sounds like you're. Go ahead, Beverly.
Okay. Well, I think that one of the things about writing is that there's a sense of abandonment. You know, good writing, we only reach that sense of abandonment at wonderful moments. It's not constant. It's otherwise a struggle with the blank page. But, you know, I think when we reach that kind of abandonment, something comes together where the mind, the creativity, and the body are working in sync, so that you understand that the character who is feeling something will express it in a way that you didn't anticipate. And then you look at the page and you say, whoa, did she really say that? You know, and that kind of surprise is what the joy of writing is, because it's if your brain knows things that you're just learning at the time of writing, which is very exciting.
Yeah. Do you have a particularly bodily relationship with any of your characters? Are some of your characters more, do they know more?
Yes, I mean, only in the sense that most of my characters are strugglers and sufferers, and people who have come from poverty, people who have tried to make it, change classes. I have a great deal of stuff on class in all of my novels. And so I understand that because I come from a working class background. So clearly I understand that.
Right.
Frequently my characters have an issue between, I have never called it body, but emotion and rational.
Yes.
That there's frequently a conflict internally between what you know you should do and what you think you should do, or what you have, what you logically know is the correct choice versus what you really want to do, or really feel like doing, or just think will make you better, happier. You know.
Part of what I'm really interested in is most of the neuroscientists right now would say that the emotion is lodged in the body. What an emotion is activated. What we see is a feeling, which is the public display. But the fact of the matter is that where that feeling came from, it's a reaction to a bodily sense. Like, we have fear, and therefore, or anger or whatever, and therefore we respond. But it's lodged in the body, you know, in terms of that. Just going back to Christina's thing, like Amy's, you know, problem and her solution is lodged in her body. And she's got to try and figure out, can she get it out? In the short story, Troublemaker, it's a disaster. And she doesn't, like, essentially she doesn't self-destruct, but she's like lost. So it's kind of curious to sort of see. So Emma, I agree with you, but what I'm curious about is also the neuroscience of how, what you're talking about, the rationality and the emotion, but the emotion comes from the body. So if you want to know what the emotions are, you got to listen to your body.
But the emotion also comes from experience. I mean, the emotion is
the experience,
a backlog of the things in life that have happened.
Yeah, but where they lodge is in your body, which is, so for example, Beverly, with trauma, like what trauma does, trauma is physically oriented. It is an experience of trauma.
Yeah.
But where does it lodge?
I have to go and get a plug for my laptop because this is longer than I expected and I don't want to stop it. So I'm going to run and plug in my laptop. While I'm away, you can keep talking about this. Sorry.
Well, David, I wanted to pick up on that trauma element, because especially in cases of trauma,
Salon ended a certain
trauma is
time.
embedded in the body and the mind, and even on a level with, you know, the traumatized person experiences time differently, and the way memories are coded, like the traumatic memory is so salient, and it's almost, you know, you could forget all these other things in your life, but it's like some rough stone that you could never is, it's always, you know, there in all its vivid moment by moment detail. So how you also recount the narrative of someone traumatized is really interesting, and how you convey that consciousness of the traumatized person. And since the trauma is so embedded, like for Luther, because his mother choked, he's frequently feels like his airway is closed off. So you almost kind of sympathize with this like the literal physical sensation of what his mother experienced. And it's a weird way of having communion with her too, to kind of experience what she experienced. And of course he has his own trauma and his own guilt of how he failed her because he couldn't do this, you know, simple maneuver. But he does also experience panic attacks characterized by, you know, feeling of being choked off. And so as he starts healing, he's able to, you know, I mean, it seems silly, but just eat normally without feeling like he's choke on something.
Oh, the book I just read, T.C. Raymond's book, Heavy, is like a textbook. If you haven't read Heavy and you get interested in this, read Heavy. This is like a textbook on your body, on what your body knows. It's remarkable. Christina, you were about to say something.
Well, you know, it's funny that you mentioned trauma, because I actually did a lot of research on trauma before I started that book, because trauma is like really behaves like a character in itself, and it triggers incidents that become actually physicalized, you know. So I actually did a lot on trauma.
That makes a lot of sense.
The vets that come back are perfect examples of that, who come back from Iraq.
And frankly, Ignatius Riley, as long as you brought him up, is a good example of his body it's a felt sense. So that's why I was curious about when you talked about Luther and you talked about, okay, so yes, his mother chokes, but the question is, how is that lodged in his body? And what you're saying makes total sense. See, what I'm interested in is can you, I don't think you can teach people, but can you have people learn to read that way? Can you have them read with a felt sense the way you all write with a felt sense?
One hopes.
It'll never get you a 5 on the AP Lit, but it might be more in other ways.
Let me drag you back, all of you back to New York City. Let me ask you, what is your favorite place in New York City that you have written in past, present, or current? Like, did you ever have a favorite writing place that you would go to write? It could be in your house, but like, where do you, like, is there a New York City place that you found that you could actually get writing done?
Well, when my daughter was very little, I used to go to the Hungarian pastry shop.
Fabulous.
Crowded and had to share a table with 50 million people, but somehow it was anonymous enough to sit there with the 5-inch space, take out the book and write. And that was then, yes.
I wonder how many books have been written in that.
Lots and lots and lots.
Mean, and theses and PhDs and I don't know. All the coffee. What about you guys?
I didn't write at this place, but it's kind of a big like a literary place in my mind. Of course, for a lot of people, the Strand. Because that's
a great place.
Yeah, after 9/11, I was standing in the Strand, and you know how we always tell people it's not, you know, whatever story you write, you know, it's been written before, but it's really how you tell the story that matters, right? So I'm standing in there, and I'm like, that's so not true. That's so much. Look at all these books. They don't need another book. No one needs another book, right? This is after 9/11. And I decided that I would only write a book that really mattered. And consequently, I had a 14-year writer's block. I did not write a single word. I wrote in circles, couldn't get anywhere. And then when I moved back to the city, I gave up on that. I was like, that's absolutely ridiculous. I'm not going to write the all-American novel. I'm just going to write a novel, so.
That's a heavy chore.
What?
It's a heavy chore to lay on yourself.
Yeah.
Carol, do you have a favorite place in New York?
Probably where I'm sitting right now. I'm pretty much a homebody when it comes to writing. I like writing at home, but there are a lot of kind of.
Were you able to do that when your kids were little? I don't know how old everybody's kids are. I made
Yeah, I mean, I set up myself in the dining room actually when my son was small, because I had to give up. I used to write in the other bedroom and I had to give it up. Yeah. So I was just trying to acclimate myself to writing somewhere else other than the second bedroom where I could shut the door and everything. And I got used to it. And now I'm just, it's kind of like my spot. So I'm very, like I said, I'm very ritualistic when it comes to writing. It's like I sit in the same spot, I write at the same place, the same table, and that's what I do. But New York is very energizing, I think, for writers, just with the stimuli that you have all the time. I feel like you're constantly being inspired by things around you, just by the physical beauty of it and by conversations you overhear, places you walk, because it's such a walking city. And, when you're walking, you're always thinking. And I find that it's just so conducive to that in a way that sometimes, when you're elsewhere in a kind of more uniform or not so, character, a city that just doesn't have the same kind of character as New York, it's just, you don't feel that kind of inspiration in the same way.
The walking city part means you get a glimpse into so many lives. So much of the time there's something going on outside that you can just get lost in, as long as nobody notices that you're watching.
The whole history of that is like Walt Whitman was the original, but the flaneur of, Ned Buntline and George Foster, there's a huge tradition of that. If you want to read one of the best of those, I think, ever, is Vivian Gornick's On the Street. Everyone performs, no one watches. And then from the seeking eye level. And she's remarkable at being able to capture the essence of the street. Honestly, because my younger son said when I was going to write another, I said, I think I've got another book I want to write, very different than Empire City. And he just looked at me and said, do you remember what it was like doing the last one? You want to try to do another one? So I had a classroom where I could go down, and I could only write on vacations because it was not possible. And you just take everything out and do it then. But I'll pick up and Carol I'll take Carol's idea of like when you're writing and what you were saying, about places. The middle of the Brooklyn Bridge, if you go and it's not under construction, there are certain places in the world, and there are not that many of them. I first discovered this taking the road from Albuquerque to Santa Fe, and there is a place when you hit the crest of the hill, and this is true at the Brooklyn Bridge. And you can think about other places where you can do what I call a 360. You can take quadrants, stand in the middle of the Brooklyn Bridge and turn 4 times around, and it is like you are in 4 different worlds. Like look down to downtown to the statue. If you can do it in your mind right now, down to the Statue of Liberty, turn, and now you're into Verrazano and in South Brooklyn. Turn, and now you're up towards the Williamsburg, and then turn, and you're into this like wonderland of like the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, and just try and remember that you were just looking down there before. If that's not inspiring, I don't know what it is.
That's good.
I have a question, which is not really about this, which is, do you know when you're having your next chat and your next salon? And
yeah, we do. In fact, I can tell you the next salon. So we have a salon on the second Tuesday of every month. And all of you people who are watching in YouTube land and Facebook land are welcome home. Welcome back home. Welcome home. You're welcome to come back, and you all can come in too. It's on October 13th. And we actually feature Wendy Walters, Andrew Simonet, and Sandy Boritzberger are going to be our next 3 panelists. And Christina, what is the theme for that one? Do you know?
It's industry to suburbia. So
Cool.
basically are getting people who are talking about settings in different pockets of America and how different everywhere is. So.
And one thing that, sorry, go ahead.
Is every salon just 2-3 hours or an hour and a half?
So they tend to be around an hour, although you guys were too fascinating, so that we went over. And but they tend to be like an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how things go and how tired we all are and how hard the day had been. But they tend to be about that long, and they are always on a theme, and all of the authors always have kids. They have written their books with kids. So the purpose of the salons really is to prove that it can be done. Because when we first started these salons in 2009, it was a time when people were telling MFA women not to have children because it was going to ruin their careers. And it's not that I'm that pro baby, but I just am very pro being able to do whatever you want. And so it's ridiculous to think that having a child should interfere with anyone's career. And if it does interfere with your career, then something is wrong with the career. Like, not that writing is a bad career, but that something is wrong with the way that the world is presenting that career, I think. Like, the arts are 24/7, parenting is 24/7. They're not both careers. Like, parenting is something else. It's not a career. It's a life choice. Event. It's a life event. It's something that happens to you or doesn't happen to you or whatever, but it's like part of your health. It's your body. It's your, anyway.
I actually had someone say to me once, "Oh, you're going to take that route." Like,
yeah, like it derails you.
I'm a real writer because I've decided I want to have a family. Like, it was kind of really like off-putting and like kind of dismissive.
I always go back to, Michael Chabon and his wife, and they are so prolific. They have a TV show out right now. They're doing Picard. Like, they're amazing. They have 4 kids. Like, you don't stop creating when you have a kid. You just have to find new ways to balance the time and the energy. You have to just, yeah. Listen, I want to tell the people in the audience who do have kids, we had an offer offered to us by Pen America, very nicely, just random. Thank you. Everybody can offer us stuff. We will take it. Anybody who is watching can get 25% off of this new course that they're doing for teenagers. It's actually not a new course, but it's newly online. So it is called the Free Speech Advocacy Institute, and it is for high school students. You have to apply by September 18th, and then they'll make the decision in 1 week. It's actually an application. You have to get selected to do this. It is on Thursday nights from October 1st to November 19th. From 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. But you can be from anywhere in the country to apply because, hello, COVID. So like the one thing that we get to do is to go to anything in any city, anytime. It is a pretty amazing sounding course. It teaches theory, law, history, and methodology behind advocating for free expression in the United States and worldwide. And like I said, if you mention that you saw it on Pen Parentis or that you heard about it on Pen Parentis, and there's like a box that says, "How did you hear about this?" So if you say you heard it on Pen Parentis, you get 25% off. So yay, win. I am going to stop the live feed. Everybody, thank you for your comments. They're very cool. I'm going to go read them now because I can't always read and talk at the same time. But we will all read the comments, and maybe we'll talk back to you on the comments if we can find them, and you. And I just want to thank you all so much for coming. Make sure you're on our what's it called, mailing list, so that you can find out what we're doing later. And that That's it, penparentis.org. That is our
Thank you very much.
And
Thank you all.
Carol and David and Beverly and of course Christina for being so amazing as usual. And then that's it. This is our
Everybody stay healthy.
our live cast. Yes, stay safe, be well, and
Be safe.
And
Bye-bye.